The Common Core standards require all teachers at every level and in every content area to help students develop the skills that they need so that they can read any content with understanding. The intent of this video is to suggest ways to help teachers meet this standard. To accomplish my intention, I have structured the video around a discussion of one of the greatest works ever written about how to read a book and to understand what you read. In the 1940s, Mortimer Adler wrote a celebrated book entitled How to Read a Book. Since that original publication, the book has been revised and reprinted for decades in multiple languages because its content continues to provide the most in-depth consideration of how to read to learn. Every content area teacher should be familiar with his approach to reading and should help students learn to monitor and perfect their own reading so that regardless of what they read, they will learn. The book is a practical book that outlines 4 critical stages of reading that move the reader from an elementary level of simply being able to recognize words on a page to the ability to make objective judgments among several books written by various authors on the same subject. Before I present his approach to reading, let me quell your concerns about the right of Mr. Adler to write such a book in the first place, and why you should consider his advice even now, some 70+ years later. First, who is Mr. Mortimer Adler? Adler was a philosopher, American educator, and author, who, after dropping in and out of college, eventually earned a doctorate degree in psychology from Columbia University, where he served as a professor. Among his achievements was the founding of the Great Books Foundation and the Great Books of the Western World. He served on the editorial board for the Britannica for decades. Mr. Adler observed and thoroughly studied the reading process, thus making him an authority worth learning from. Although many reading fads have come and gone since the 1940s, some things have not changed. Principal among these constants is the fact that, as Mr. Adler points out, readers must learn to read different things at different appropriate speeds, not everything at the greatest possible speed. Adler reminds us that more than 300 years ago, Pascal observed that when we read too fast or too slowly, we understand nothing. In his book, Mr. Adler identifies 4 distinctive levels of reading: elementary reading, inspectional reading, analytical reading, and syntopical or comparative reading. At each level, the reader has a different purpose, which obviously requires a different set of skills. However, it is important to understand that the skill levels build on one another. In other words, until the elementary level skills are mastered, inspectional reading cannot be achieved, and so forth. The highest level of reading, syntopical or comparative reading, is the most complex and systematic type of reading and should be the ultimate goal of any reader whose purpose in reading is to learn and to understand, rather than simply to be informed or entertained. Let me say that it is impossible to provide the in-depth discussion that Mr. Adler deserves in this short video, but I will attempt to provide a basic understanding of each of the reading levels he identified, and would highly recommend that you pursue a more careful reading of this great book. The first level of reading, which Adler calls elementary reading, is what he recognizes as the foundation for other levels of reading. It is an important rudimentary step toward the ultimate ability to read a book. But he laments the reality that this is the only level of reading typically taught in school. At this level, the goal of the reader is simply to recognize words on a page. Adler is critical of the fact that very little teaching about reading is pursued after the primary grades, leaving readers on their own to try to actually teach themselves how to gain knowledge through reading. The schools simply stop teaching reading once a student has learned to decode the printed word, acquired a basic academic vocabulary, and read fluently enough to recall basic information from a textbook. However, stopping instruction at this level will never enable students to learn to acquire knowledge from print. True, students may become superficially informed once they have accomplished the elementary level, but they will never know or understand. In the contemporary setting, media of all types are available to students who simply need to be informed, and who don't really need to know anything beyond a superficial acquaintance with the world. However, simply acquiring a shallow information base should never be the goal of an educated individual, or the target of a great educational system. Knowledge requires study, and print continues to be a major source for more in-depth study. The second level of reading that Adler identifies is inspectional reading. The goal of the reader at this level is primarily to determine whether or not the book deserves to be read. In other words, the reader engages in a skimming or pre-reading process to determine if the book will help them to acquire the knowledge they are looking for. Adler recommends reading the title page, the preface, the table of contents, glancing through the index or glossary, if they are included, and reading a paragraph here and there throughout the book, especially the last several pages. Once the book has been skimmed and deemed worthy of more scrutiny, Adler recommends reading the book straight through without stopping to be concerned about the things not immediately understood. He recommends that readers attend to what they do understand and avoid being stopped by what they don't immediately grasp. He suggests that a reader not be deterred on an initial reading by the footnotes, inserts, and so forth. These interruptions tend to bog the reader down and get in the way of reading the entire book, which is the ultimate goal in inspectional reading. According to Adler, even if only 50% of the contents is understood by reading the book straight through to the end, readers will be better prepared when they read it through again. Or if they never reread it, understanding half of a really tough book is much better than not understanding it at all. Furthermore, Adler suggests that during inspectional reading, when we pay too much attention to the things we do not understand and run to the dictionary or other references to clarify our confusion during the initial reading, we become bogged down and often never finish reading the book. He is particularly critical of the way Shakespeare's great works are read in school. Reading scene by scene, looking up strange words in the glossary, and so forth, causes students to lose sight of the whole, and often by the time they reach the end of the play, they have forgotten the beginning. Instead, he recommends reading the play at one sitting and discussing what they got out of the first quick reading. Then he advocates going back through the play to clarify areas of confusion. Basically, if inspectional reading is not practiced, and readers try to understand everything on every page of a book, Adler suggests that they will not get very far. If they focus on minor points, they will miss the big ideas. Thus, inspectional reading is a critical step toward the third level of reading, which is analytical reading. According to Adler, analytical reading is a more complex and a more systematic activity. It is thorough reading, it is intensely active reading, and it takes time. He points out that analytical reading is hardly ever necessary if the reader is simply seeking information or entertainment. To the contrary, analytical reading is for those who are seeking understanding. Adler divides analytical reading into 3 stages and identifies rules that the reader must follow in each stage. The goal of analytical reading is to answer 4 basic questions about a book. First, what is the book about as a whole? Second, what is the book saying in detail, and how is the argument structured? Third, is the book true in whole or part? And fourth, what is the significance of what the author is saying? To answer each of these questions, Adler spells out a set of rules for each stage in the analytical process. In the first stage of analytical reading, the reader must identify the type of book it is, explain succinctly what the book is about, outline the structure of the book, and identify what question the author is trying to answer or what problem he is trying to solve. First, to find out what a book is about, a reader must classify the whole book. In other words, the reader must determine whether the book is fiction, a novel, a play, an epic, a lyric, or an expository work. If it is non-fiction, is it philosophical, scientific, historical, mathematical, theoretical, or practical? To achieve this initial first step, the reader must engage in inspectional reading by reading the title, title page, and so forth. Next, the reader must determine what the book is about. This is not the same thing as knowing what type of book it is. In determining what the book is about, the reader identifies the theme or main point of the book and is able to identify the intent of the book in no more than 1 or 2 sentences. If a book is well written, it will have a unity about it that can easily be articulated in a few words. After articulating what the book is about, the reader must determine the significant individual parts of a book and how they are related to the whole. A well-written book is not a mere collection of isolated parts, but a complex unity of organized, interrelated parts. In a well-written novel, there is a thread of plot that ties every episode together. In nonfiction, the author frequently lays out the structure, outline, or plan of the book in the preface or opening paragraphs. Knowing the structure of the book helps the reader follow a targeted trajectory through the argument presented by the author. Finally, in analytical reading, the reader must discover the question the author is trying to answer, or the problem he is trying to solve. If the author does not explain up front what he is attempting to address in the book, then the reader must formulate a question that he thinks that the book tries to answer. Sample questions that authors try to address include basic questions that anyone can ask about anything. For example, an author may address theoretical questions such as, does something exist? Or under what conditions can it exist? What kind of a thing is it? What caused it to exist? Or why does it exist? What purpose does it serve? What are the consequences of its existence? What are its characteristics, property, typical traits? What are its relations to other things of a similar sort or of a different sort? How does it behave? On the other hand, the author may be seeking the answer to practical questions, such as, what goals should be sought? What things must one do to gain a certain objective, and in what order? Under particular condition, what is the right thing to do, or the better rather than the worse? Under what conditions would it be better to do this rather than that? In the second stage of analytical reading, the goal of the reader is to interpret the contents of the book. To achieve this goal, the reader and author must accurately communicate with one another. In other words, both must come to the same understanding of the terms used in the book. Words often have more than one meaning. For accurate communication from author to reader, both must use the same words with the same meanings. According to Adler, only then can two minds reach a single thought. This coming to terms, as Adler describes it, refers to expository works only. Poetry and fiction are not so concerned with reaching a common meaning. To reach a common understanding, the reader must locate the key words and determine the precise meaning of these words as used by the author. Adler states that the likelihood of the meeting of minds through language depends on the willingness of both reader and writer to work together. Locating key words can be aided in several ways. First, to the reader, words that are unfamiliar or that cause confusion are typically important. But there are other signs that point to important words. For example, the author may use typographical devices to stress key terms. He may bold, italicize, or surround keywords with quotation marks. Or he may call the reader's attention to the words by explicitly discussing its various uses and explaining how it is used by him, or by providing a specific definition. Readers who have some knowledge of the content of the book can recognize keywords that are typically associated with the subject and those that are new or unfamiliar. As most reading teachers understand, helping students use the context of all the other words surrounding an unfamiliar word is an important strategy in determining the meaning of new terms. Other important skills in the second stage of analytical reading involve determining the author's message. The reader needs to discover not only what propositions the author is making, but how and why he argues that the reader must believe them. The important thing that a reader must know at this point in his reading is that an author's assertions or propositions are nothing but expressions of personal opinion, unless they are supported by logical reasoning, definitive evidence, or high probability. To analyze the author's reasoning, readers must mark the important sentences in a book, analyze the propositions they contain, and construct the basic arguments in the book, including the evidence used to support the arguments. Finally, the reader must determine which of his problems the author solved and which he didn't. The third stage of analytical reading involves criticizing a book fairly. Adler discusses the importance of suspending judgment on any author until the reader can honestly say that he understood the book's structure, intent, and so forth. In criticizing a book, the reader must follow general intellectual etiquette, avoiding contentiousness and degradation. A criticism must show that the reader recognizes the difference between opinion and knowledge, and must present good reasons for any critical judgment. Several points of criticism to consider include whether the author was uninformed, misinformed, illogical, or incomplete. The final two questions readers must ask in analytical reading are, is there truth in the book? And if so, what is the significance of that truth? The truth of every kind of writing can be judged in such senses as mathematical, scientifical, philosophical, historical, and poetical. Adler laments that few critics discuss the truth of a piece of work, using instead other standards of judgment, such as the book's novelty, sensationalism, seductiveness, force, or power to bemuse or befuddle, but not their truth, their clarity, or power to enlighten. If a book is not true in any sense, there is no need to answer the final question, what of it? But if the book is true, the reader must determine its personal and global significance. Facts are always interpreted either implicitly or explicitly. The fourth level of reading discussed by Adler is syntopical or comparative reading, which is the most complex and systematic type of reading. This type of reading places heavy demands on the reader. It involves the reader in reading two or more books, not just one, and requires the reader to place them in relation to one another and to the subject about which they are written. When accomplished, syntopical reading often enables the reader to construct an analysis of a subject that may not have appeared in any of the books. According to Adler, this level of reading is the most rewarding of all reading. Syntopical reading requires two things: knowing that more than one book is relevant to a particular question, and knowing which books should be read. As with analytical reading, syntopical reading involves multiple steps, which include finding the relevant passages, bringing the various authors to terms, getting the questions clear, defining the issues, and analyzing the decision. Although there are obvious difficulties in each of the steps in syntopical reading, Adler offers specific ways to accomplish them. In the first step, finding the relevant passages, Adler suggests creating a tentative bibliography of the subject by recourse to library catalogs, advisors, and bibliographies in books, and then inspecting all of the books on the tentative bibliography to determine which are most germane to the targeted subject. The second step, bringing the various authors to terms, is, according to Adler, the most difficult aspect of syntopical reading and is rife with criticism, stemming from the fact that not all authors on the same subject use the same terms to describe similar ideas. Thus, when the authors don't use the same terms, the reader has to find a common ground term that captures the idea. Adler's suggestion for accomplishing this step involves constructing a neutral terminology of the subject that the majority of the authors employ, whether they use the exact terms or not. In the third step involved in syntopical reading, which is getting the questions clear, Adler recommends framing a set of questions to which all or most of the authors can be interpreted as giving an answer, whether they actually treat the questions explicitly or not. Next, to define the issues, Adler suggests arranging the answers to the questions by the various authors on one side or the other of an issue. The reader must be objective in determining the author's viewpoint on an issue. So, to ensure such objectivity in stating an author's viewpoint on an issue, Adler recommends that the interpretation should be accompanied by a direct quote from the author. Finally, to analyze the discussion, the reader should order the questions and issues in such a way as to throw maximum light on the subject. Adler admits that there are those who believe that reaching the ability to engage in syntopical reading is impossible for several reasons. First, critics state that it is wrong to impose a neutral terminology on any author. An author's use of terms is considered sacrosanct, and meaning is often lost in translation. Secondly, reading authors widely separated in time and space and differing in style and approach distorts the facts of the matter. And finally, critics of syntopical reading argue that the subjects that authors discuss are not as important as the ways in which they discuss them. On the other hand, Adler believes that accurate translation of terms over time and space is possible, that books can talk to one another just as human beings do, and that we can learn from one another when we engage in rational thought. In addition to identifying and differentiating between various levels of reading, Adler offers specific suggestions for how to read specific types of books. For example, to gain a thorough understanding of a historical event or period, Adler suggests that the reader must absolutely read more than one account of the history of the event or period. He points out that because theories of history differ, and because an historian's theoretical stance affects his account of events, it is necessary to read more than one account of the history of an event or period if a reader expects to understand it. This rule is even more important if the event holds particular significance. Adler reminds us that every narrative history is written from some point of view. Thus, to get at the truth of any history, readers must look at it from more than one viewpoint. If they are unable to read more than one history of an event, readers must admit that they do not have much chance of learning what really happened. However, not all is lost in being able only to read one account of an historical period. Though readers of single historical accounts may never understand what really happened, they can learn other things from the narrative. For example, historical accounts provide a perspective on humankind, how they act in all times and places. A single account can also provide some insight about the influence of the event on the subsequent history of humankind. Adler recommends that the question one must ask about an historical account are those that one asks about other expository literature. Thus, the reader must always ask the following questions when reading history. What is the specific subject of the historical account? Every history has a particular and limited subject, so readers must be clear about what the specific subject is that is being explored. Thus, in order to read a history well, the reader must know what it is about and what it is not about. The second question we must ask of a history is about how the historian has structured the account. There is more than one way to tell a story, and the reader must determine how the historian has decided to tell his. Has he divided the work into chapters by years, events, and so forth? If readers determine which aspect of the story the author is telling and how he is telling it, they can better understand what he deems most fundamental about the event. The final question that must always be asked of a historical account is, what of it? According to Adler, no kind of literature has a greater effect on the actions of humankind than history. History suggests the possible, for it describes things that have already been done. If they have been done, perhaps they can be done again, or perhaps they can be avoided. With the world as small and dangerous as it has become, it would be a good idea for all of us to start reading history better, according to Adler. As to recommendations for reading science, Adler admits that he doesn't have the qualifications to give advice about how to read every kind of science and mathematics. Furthermore, he suggests that modern scientists do not care what lay readers think, and so they don't try to reach them. Today, science tends to be written by experts for experts. However, regardless of these obstacles, Adler feels that all readers must learn how to read science classics, or at least how to read scientific popularizations that are written for a wide audience rather than specialists. With that in mind, every reader of scientific literature must read actively. First, readers must identify as clearly as possible the problem that the author has tried to solve. Discover the relation between the whole and its parts. Come to terms and plot the propositions and arguments. Work at achieving understanding before beginning to criticize or assess the significance. In regards to mathematics, Adler feels that the reader's confusion lies in the fact that they do not understand that mathematics is a language and that they can learn it like any other language. He points out that learning a new written language always involves problems like those in elementary reading. Since mathematics is a language, it has its own vocabulary, grammar, and syntax, and these have to be learned by the beginning reader of mathematics. Symbols and relationships between symbols have to be memorized. Adler also offers rules for reading imaginative or fictional reading. His primary caution about reading fiction is always to be alert to and appreciate the effect that the work has on you. Unlike expository literature, which tries to convey knowledge about experiences, imaginative works try to communicate an experience itself for the reader to enjoy. The reader's tasks in reading fiction include classifying the work according to its kind. Is it a lyric, a novel, a play, etc.? Next, the reader must grasp the unity of the whole work and be able to express it in a sentence or two. The unity of fiction is always in its plot. Once the plot is clearly articulated, the reader must determine how the plot is constructed out of all of its parts, including the characterization, episodes, and incidents, as the story moves from the beginning through its middle to its end. However, given the need to know about the work of fiction, Adler cautions that the most important point to remember is that you cannot appreciate a novel by reading it passively. Readers must read works of fiction passionately, with total awareness of how it affects them. Only when readers have read a work with passion can they judge it. In judgment, readers must not only determine whether they liked or disliked the book and why, they must be able to tell what was good and bad about the book and why. There is much more practical and specific advice that Adler offers to every reader in his book. This video provides a brief overview of his key ideas and principles. Reading is a skill that is part of the human experience, and it will continue to be so. Whether it be from a book, on a tablet, smartphone, or computer screen, we will always read. If there is one idea that viewers take away from this video, I hope it is the message that reading to learn and to understand takes work. As Adler states in his book, reading is an activity that requires action. The more active the reading, the better the reading. The better the reading, the more is learned.